Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we study God's Word together in the Unfolding the Word ministry. As you know, we're in the midst of the book of Daniel. We're now in the second half of Daniel. We began to look at chapter 7 of Daniel, which is about a dream, a prophetic dream that God had sent to Daniel about the flow of human history. I'm going to pick up our reading today in verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, "Arise and devour much flesh." As you know, this prophetic dream, and we've been talking about it, is a dream about the flow of human history. In that sense, it parallels the dream that was sent to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. But chapter 7 gives us more details, particularly about the latter kingdoms in the flow of human history. The dream is established and structured around 7 scenes, like 7 scenes in an act, different slices of history in the unfolding flow of human history. Think of them that way. The images that are used, and we looked at those, are the image of churning seas, which biblically refers to humanity and its unfolding history, which often looks very turbulent. Beasts, which represent kingdoms that God establishes and emerge out of the flow of history. And the 4 winds of heaven refer to God's control over the nature of the world and time. And also at times refers to angels that he has sent for various tasks. At any rate, yesterday we looked at the first of these scenes, the kingdom of the flying lion, that beast, which was clearly Babylon, the kingdom that was still in control at the time the prophetic dream was given to Daniel. Now today we want to continue in our study, and I want to look at the second scene in the unfolding dream, the unfolding of history. And this is the dream of the kingdom of the beast, of the bear beast. Parallels, by the way, the silver kingdom, the silver part of the image in the chapter 2 dream of Nebuchadnezzar. The second beast here, the bear beast, refers to the coming Medo-Persian Empire. Now remember, the Medo-Persian Empire did not totally defeat the Babylonian Empire until 10 years following the dream coming to Daniel. So Daniel was still living under the power of the Babylonian Empire, the final king of Babylon, which was Belshazzar, although he was marginalized at this stage of his life. One of the things the dream tells us about this Medo-Persian Empire, this bear beast, is that one side of the bear was higher than the other. And the picture that emerges from that is that this particular kingdom, if we're trying to identify it, needs to be a kingdom that's made up of 2 parts, one part bigger and higher than the other part. And that was clearly the nature of the Medo-Persians. The Persians initially defeated the Medes in their beginning development as an empire. Then the Medes combined together with the Persians in a cooperative venture as the empire continued to grow and eventually destroyed the other empires, including Babylon. As time went on, the Medes, which were really a secondary group to begin with, eventually subsurged, really did not continue to be a distinctive group, so that the empire was known as the Persian Empire as time went on. One of the things also about this dream and introducing us to the Medo-Persian Empire is that a bear, using that image here, is bigger than a lion and yet slower moving, although they can move pretty fast when they have to, but not as fast as a lion can. And that was a good description also of the Medo-Persian Empire. It grew more slowly than the Babylonian Empire did under Nebuchadnezzar. It took longer to achieve the full extent of its empire. It grew bigger, however, than Babylon ever had been, and it persisted much longer than Babylon persisted. So it's a pretty good picture. It's pretty clear who's being referred to here in this part of the dream, although understand that at the time the dream was given, the Medo-Persian Empire had not yet become the true empire, and the Babylonians were still in power, at least in a portion of the former empire. The bear beast is also presented to us here as a beast that had 3 ribs in its mouth. And I think clearly the idea here is that that particular empire, if we're trying to identify it in history, is an empire that had 3 major conquests under its belt. 3 conquests that really defined much of the empire. And that's really what happened in the Medo-Persians. Initially, before they defeated Babylon, they combined together, the Medo-Persians defeated the Lydian kingdom, which was in Asia Minor, much of modern Turkey. They defeated that kingdom, took it over, and incorporated its peoples and incorporated its armies in 546 BC, which was basically 7 years before the defeat of Babylon. Now that defeat of the Lydians was still future at the time the dream came to Daniel. So Daniel was not knowing of that particular defeat, that it was still future. Nonetheless, that was the key defeat. The second of the ribs in the mouth of the bear was clearly Babylon, which had to be defeated and overcome for the Medo-Persians to expand to the full extent of their empire. And as I say, that occurred in 539 BC. We saw the last night of that empire, of the Babylonian Empire, in chapter 5. Eventually, the Medo-Persians continued to expand, and their empire defeated the empire of the Egyptians in 525 BC, and as a result began to spread across North Africa and down the Nile region. 3 ribs, primarily accounting for the vast expansion. No, there were lots of smaller kingdoms defeated too, but there were 3 mega kingdoms, the Lydian, the Babylonian, and the Egyptians, that all fell to the Medo-Persians. God gave a command, if not literally, at least he worked the command out and planted what was necessary for the command to work out within the Medo-Persian leaders. And it was this: arise and devour much flesh. What that idea is that God had built into the thinking, the psyche of the Medo-Persians, the desire to keep on devouring their neighbors. One of the characteristics historians identify with the Medo-Persian Empire is what they call an insatiable appetite for conquest. They had never defeated enough. They were constantly stretching the empire, constantly trying to take over new regions. They could never stop trying to defeat others. In that devouring of much flesh, that insatiable appetite led them into a very disastrous period of conquest against the Greeks. Several times they sought to go across the Aegean and defeat Greece and the Greek city-states. Each time they did not succeed completely. And the effort, being such a difficult effort, depleted the empire and depleted its resources, certainly depleted its armies. And one of the other things that happened as a result of that is that it ensured that for a couple hundred years, the enemy number one in the minds of the Greeks would be Persia. And in point of fact, resentment among the Greeks continued to grow, so that every problem they had was put at the feet of the Persians. Now, the Persians weren't the cause of every problem, but it was easy to have someone to blame, a scapegoat. And so Persia became that and continued to deepen that mentality in the Greeks because of their insatiable appetite and their refusal to give up trying to conquer Greece. One of the things, after generation to generation of growing resentment and anger among the Greeks toward the Persians is that as Alexander the Macedonian came on the scene, who we came to call Alexander the Great, his biggest goal was the defeat of the Persians. And as Alexander the Great began to grow his empire, it inevitably turned eastward with the primary goal to get back at the hated Persians. And it is that kingdom that the third scene of the prophetic dream introduces us to, the kingdom of the flying leopard king. So join me tomorrow, Lord willing. We'll continue to look at these scenes of the unfolding of the flow of history in Daniel chapter 7. God bless.